China is America's #1 pacing threat. We've been hearing that from some of our military leaders for quite a number of years now, that even more than Russia, it's China that we need to worry about. That's where we need to focus all of our interest. And in recent days, we've had actually in recent years, we've had some of the senior commanders of the Indo-Pacific Command and others related out there keep telling us that China is on a buildup for war and that our policies there are meant to deter China. They are meant to push them back and to keep them from having any kind of an assault on Taiwan, which some mischaracterize as our ally. They are not our ally. But the big question is, are our policies actually succeeding and deterring China from conflict, or are they undermining it and actually increasing the risk that we actually have conflict? We have nobody better to discuss this today than with friend of the show, Ambassador Chaz Freeman, who was in fact part of the group that set up the whole issue of the U.S. rapprochement with China back in the 70s, was later part of the embassy staff up there. Chaz, welcome back to the show. We're so grateful to have your views on today.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Well, let's just jump right into it. And by the way, just for all those who may be noticing there's other things going on, we're going to talk about this issue here, and then we're going to circle back toward the end about what's happening and unfolding as we speak in Moscow. There's been a horrible terrorist event up there with lots of people killed and lots of potential ramifications, but we'll get back to that here shortly. But let's jump in on this one first. Now, there was a hearing on the Hill where the commander of the Indo-Pacific Command, Admiral Aquilino, made some pretty bold and scary statements about what's at stake in the Asia Pacific.
But what we all have to understand is we haven't faced a threat like this since World War II. Okay, the largest military, again, as Senator Wicker said, the world's largest Navy, soon to be the world's largest Air Force. So the magnitude, scope, and scale of this security challenge cannot be understated.
Now, I don't think anybody probably understands the complex situation with the national security and the international flair that throughout the area in the Indo-Pacific than you do. And what concerns me when I hear him say this statement is the strong implication of trying to harken back to those World War II scary days of, Pearl Harbor, things that led to that, and that if China is rising militarily, then it must mean an attack is imminent. But I think that the conditions that led to Japan actually doing that in the 1930s is radically different than what we have today. What is your view on what he said there about Japan or China rising up to a new World War II type threat?
Well, China does not threaten the United States. It is engaged in an unfinished civil war. Taiwan was where the retreating Kuomintang troops of Chiang Kai-shek went in 1949 when they lost the civil war on the mainland. Everybody thought, including the U.S. government, and we said so, that the communist forces would cross the Taiwan Strait and finish unifying all of China under them. That didn't happen because the Korean War intervened, and in order to prevent that war from widening, keeping it limited, President Truman ordered the 7th Fleet to prevent both sides, both the communists and the KMT, Chiang Kai-shek in Taiwan, from attacking each other and thus widening the war. So this is a civil war that would have ended decades ago. Gradually, the United States cozied up to Taiwan. I spent much of my early career in the Foreign Service, going to the United Nations and elsewhere and saying, there's only one China. Its capital is not in Beijing, it is in Taipei. The government in Taipei is entitled to represent China everywhere. It is not a government in exile because Taiwan is part of China, and so forth and so on. Well, we seem to have modified our view, and I note that there are no Chinese aircraft or ships patrolling off the U.S. coast or making mock runs at U.S. harbors or airfields, but we do that several times a day off the China coast. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I would argue that this is not deterrence; it is provocation. And I took note in the 1990s when we broke one of the agreements we'd made with the Chinese and admitted the president of Taiwan to the United States, where he was feted by members of Congress and gave a speech extolling Taiwan independence, that resulted in a naval face-off in which two American aircraft carriers were deployed, not to the Taiwan Strait, as is usually said, but to the Philippine seas. One of them didn't make it actually until after the crisis was over. Later on, that is in 1999, the first one was in 1995, the president of Taiwan gave a speech to the Deutsche Welle, the German radio station, in which he declared that there were two states, two Chinese states. And in response, and following up on the US naval confrontation several years earlier, the Chinese began for the first time to expand their forces at a rapid rate. At that point, they had not built a single landing craft. While they had talked about liberating Taiwan, they had in fact done virtually nothing to enable them to do that. Since then, what we've seen is an escalation of force on both sides. US doubling down in its opposition to China, China doubling down in building its armed forces to counter that. And I don't think the Chinese really have any desire whatsoever to get into a war over Taiwan. But if they're left with no option, and we're doing everything possible to deny them other options, peaceful settlement is nothing we support, then sooner or later, I fear Chinese nationalism will force them to act. We are headed for a bloody rendezvous with Chinese nationalism, but they are not planning to attack us. If we attack them, they will.
So now, earlier this week, I believe it was on Tuesday when the admiral was speaking first. He had made some public admission, as had the I believe it was the Minister of Defense of Taiwan had also acknowledged publicly that U.S. Special Forces were not just on Taiwan proper, but were on Quemoy Island, which is literally a rock's throw from the Chinese coast. And the Pentagon spokesman, when asked about it, said, well, this is just something that we're doing to deter China and to keep the Asia-Pacific region safe and secure and free. What do you say when you hear things like that? Because I know you've told me before that there, back in the 70s, there was some things that specifically required U.S. troops not be on those locations.
We agreed with the Chinese first in Shanghai, Richard Nixon, that we would withdraw forces from Taiwan as the prospects for peaceful settlement improved. In 1979, when we normalized relations with Beijing, we made three commitments: no official relations with Taiwan, no U.S. military presence on Taiwan, no defense commitment to Taiwan. And the Chinese people on the two sides of the strait should work this out among themselves, we said. That was our consistent position. Now we have a relationship with Taipei that is official in all but name. We have the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, going there. We have members of the cabinet going. We have Taiwan officials, the Vice President, for example, of Taiwan, newly elected, coming here. We have troops back on the island, and we never had troops in Quemoy, Jinmen, even during the offshore island crisis at the end of the 50s, or mid-50s and the late 50s, which was a big thing in the 1960 election between Nixon and Kennedy, if you remember. Even then, we were very careful not to insert ourselves into the Chinese Civil War. Now we're there. Jinmen is 2 miles away from Xiamen, one of the major cities on the capital. 2 miles. This is like putting Chinese troops on Staten Island and, expecting people in New York to think it's not threatening. It's deterrent somehow. And finally, I would note that the president, who has no constitutional authority to launch a war without congressional approval, who has legislation in the Taiwan Relations Act that defines the nature of our defense relationship with Taiwan. Namely, we are supposed to supply weapons to allow Taiwan to defend itself, and we are supposed to maintain sufficient force to act if that becomes necessary, not necessarily in the case of defending Taiwan, but in the area as a whole. He has on 4 occasions threatened to go to war with China over Taiwan.
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying, we have a tendency to blame everybody else for everything that happens. We never make mistakes. We keep our word. Well, I can tell you, nobody in Beijing believes we keep our word, because we haven't. And that is a large part of the problem here. Now, there are other problems. Taiwan has become an admirable society. It has a very high standard of rule of law, human rights. It's a democracy. All of that is very good. Potentially, that could be very helpful in a future transformation of China. But it won't be if the Chinese mainland feels obliged to use force to end this problem. They feel constantly threatened. They're reminded by the existence of Taiwan's autonomy of the fact that it was taken away from them by the Japanese as part of a European, American, and Japanese division of China in the 19th and 20th century. Something like 25 to 30 million Chinese died at the hands of the Japanese during their 14-year rampage through the country. And, we're bringing back all these memories. Plus, 2 revolutions in the 20th century in China, both had identical objectives. The Chinese Nationalist Revolution 1911 under Sun Yat-sen, the 1949 revolution under Mao Zedong, both saw the major objective of China's destiny to be the recovery of national unity, an end to foreign spheres of influence on Chinese territory, the establishment of a strong central government, and the restoration of foreign respect for China after 150 years of essentially humiliation.
Yeah.
So all these things are constantly reminded. The Chinese are constantly reminded of all of this. We, of course, don't remember a word of it. Most Americans think Taiwan is just some kind of separate country that's being, there's no history there.
Right.
Really, this is a microcosm of a general problem we have in our foreign policy, which is ignorant pursuit of feelings, willingness to start wars that have no defined objectives, no feasible objectives, no benchmarks for measuring progress or retreat, and no war termination strategy. If we get into a war with China,
other than that, we're doing really good. But
if we get into a war with China, it's not going to be over in a few weeks.
Yeah.
This is a fundamental issue for the Chinese. It's not for us.
Now, unfortunately, this seems to really tail in really well with what you just said, because I'm going to show you an exchange between Senator Tom Cotton and the Admiral when he asked him. Notice the way he phrases this question is pretty significant, because it actually echoes back to what you said that the president has said on 4 occasions, almost like the implication that we're going to go to war to fight China over Taiwan. Here, watch his question and look at the answer.
Why should the United States be willing to risk our sons and daughters? Why should we make the massive investment in deterrent capability in your region to stop China from invading and annexing Taiwan?
Yes, sir. There's a variety of reasons why it matters. First, as it applies to the rules and the rule of law that we follow and adhere to, that has made the world a better place, that has allowed for the prosperity of all nations in the post-World War II environment, that would be under attack, first of all. And that ties all the way to the illegal invasion of Ukraine, right? That's an assault on the rules-based order. So critically important. Second, the democracy, the thriving democracy that exists there, the values, freedom of navigation, all of the things that we value in the United States interests are tied to that. Third, the ability of the United States in the current way semiconductors are laid out is critically important for all industry and all the things that we have inside the United States. When you look at 90+% of high-end chips emit from Taiwan.
So the United States military should commit to the defense of Taiwan because of an assault on the rules-based order, because of freedom of navigation, which I've never seen anybody in China threaten, democracy, which doesn't really mean anything. It's just a big term, and then semiconductors. So that's what he's saying, that we should potentially risk American sons and daughters, not because China is going to attack the United States, not because they're going to do a Pearl Harbor kind of thing, but because of these things that are, you have to go searching for them. That just doesn't make any sense to me at all.
Let me take those in reverse order. War is a gamble. You never know how it's going to turn out. The one thing that is certain in any war over Taiwan is that Taiwan will be devastated, its industry destroyed, and its democracy ruined. It doesn't matter whether the mainland manages to take Taiwan back or not. That part of the result is foreordained. Every scenario that's been run by us in war games shows that both the United States and China, you lose the bulk of our navies and air forces if we get into a direct fight. It doesn't address the question of nuclear escalation. War is not an option in terms of saving the industry of Taiwan or the supply chains that connect us to it. Second, with regard to democracy, I, for one, believe that we should be worrying about our own democracy, not one that is functioning extremely well in Taiwan, and that a peaceful resolution of this issue, which left Taiwan's democracy intact, which is something that the mainland has repeatedly offered, would be a much better solution. Third, the freedom of navigation issue is ridiculous in this instance because, as is the case in the South China Sea, 2/3 of the merchant marine traffic is going to or from China. Nobody has a bigger stake in preserving freedom of navigation for commercial purposes than the Chinese. The threat to freedom of navigation of that sort is from us in the context of a Taiwan contingency. We would try to blockade the Chinese. And finally, going to the issue of the rules-based order, there is nothing in international law that justifies foreign intervention in civil wars. We recognize one China. That is our official position. We have waffled on the question of what Taiwan's relationship with China is. Taiwan is now full of people who are prepared to, apparently, to fight to the last American to separate themselves from China. There's nothing in that for us. We should be encouraging dialogue, peaceful resolution, and we should be true to our own statements that there is only one China, not two. There are not two Chinese states. There's only one. We recognize one. We should not encourage another to emerge. But that is what we're doing. So this is not a defense of the status quo. We are trying to change it. We are aiding and abetting separatism. And that's a mistake.
I completely agree. And to just underscore for any of our viewers who may not be aware of what you just said a second ago, I'm going to show you a couple of specific clips about what happens when the United States actually engages in simulation with the Chinese. Now, first of all, I'm going to show you something that an expert in Australia, who obviously is very interested in this situation, what he had to say.
As Asia changes, all kinds of bets are off. China has increased very sharply its capacity to sink American ships. And if we see the US and China going head to head in Asia, then the fact that China's got a lot more power than it used to have could make a real difference to Australia, and we could find ourselves being drawn in.
And there was an exercise done by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, which ran a number of simulations, which came to some very, very stark conclusions, which many Americans may not know. Interesting, in the clip you're about to see, the claim is that the U.S. was successful in preventing China from taking over Taiwan, but at somewhat of a cost.
The war game assesses that the U.S. loses 10 to 20 combat ships, including 2 aircraft carriers, and 200 to 400 military aircraft.
That last one may be a bigger shock to me than even the aircraft carriers, which one would be catastrophic for our image. But one of the guys who ran this, Mark Kansian of CSIS, expanded a little bit more on exactly how that came to pass.
In most of the iterations, the United States loses about 500 aircraft. In the most pessimistic ones, that goes up to about 900 aircraft. Often we lose 2 carriers, maybe 20 to 30 surface combatants, but are able to maintain Taiwan as an autonomous entity. So we succeed, but at extremely high.
It was necessary to destroy the country to save it. I mean, this is the mentality. What's left after all this? You think the Chinese, who have the world's largest ballistic missile and cruise missile arsenal in the world's largest, you think they're not going to use those? You know, we have been, in some respects, significantly outclassed militarily by the Chinese. Their air-to-air missiles outrange ours. They have ballistic missiles that are capable of striking carrier battle groups 1,500 to 2,000 miles offshore. They have the ability to flatten Guam, which is where we've piled up a huge amount of military power. They will not want to attack Japan, but if Japan lets us use airfields there, and it's not clear they would, the Chinese will take them out. So we'll get a wider war involving Japan and China and probably others. Yeah. I think the Australians, who, in my experience, punch above their weight intellectually, they're a smaller country. They have to try harder. They think better. I think they have every reason to be deeply concerned about the trend of events and the sort of belligerent attitude that we are taking.
So, you know, one of the things that I said, I made a comment there that the loss of the aircraft really jumped out at me, because in the base case, I think it was several hundred, 300 to 400, but in some of the pessimistic cases, up to around 900. By means of comparison, the Ukraine Air Force has probably lost somewhere around 50 aircraft shot down since the war, for 2+ years of war there in Russia, maybe 50 to 75, depends on who you want to believe. But those are relatively small, and you're talking about 4 and 5 and 6 times more than that likely U.S. aircraft loss if we continue to press a bad situation, and that should be shocking.
Let me make a key point. Ukraine is a proxy war. There may be NATO personnel on the ground in Ukraine. There have been since 2008 at least, training the Ukrainian army and re-equipping it and restructuring it. But it's a proxy war. Anything over Taiwan is a direct war with a nuclear power over its territory, conducted 6,000 to 8,000 miles from the United States, very long logistical chain, right on the doorstep of the world's largest military force. If you think that's smart, then I think you need some help.
And kind of to drive that point home a little more, there was an article by Jeffrey Sachs from New York that came out. I think it was today. I think it came out of one of your services there, that he's basically saying we need to put a lot more effort into diplomacy. And when you, as a former diplomat, who's also formerly worked in the Department of Defense, so you kind of have both experiences of wearing both hats, when you see things like what the Admiral was talking about there, and how the idea is we need much more military muscle, we need more powerful ships, we need more aircraft, we need more missiles, we need all that stuff. What do you think when you hear that is juxtaposed with what Professor Sachs had said?
Well, essentially, we've been conducting a diplomacy-free foreign policy in many arenas, not just with regard to China. Remember the first encounter between the Biden administration and the Chinese in Anchorage. We went in there and we said, you are moral reprobates. We dislike you. We're going to keep you down if we can. We'll push you back if we can. But there are 1 or 2 things we need your help on. Could you help us? That is not diplomacy. That is giving offense in the most brutal way, even if it didn't involve the Chinese, who are very concerned with face, which is the self-respect you get from others respecting you. We demonstrated total disrespect and hostility right at the outset, and we haven't wavered from that. We are conducting an economic and technological war with China, trying to shut off its markets, trying to cut off its access to technology. I happen to think that is very foolish, because the world's largest population of STEM workers, scientists, technologists, engineers, mathematicians, over 1/4 of the world's STEM workers are Chinese, and they are inventing stuff right and left. And they are ahead of us in a lot of key technologies, some of which are the crucial technologies for the future. Renewable energy, solar power, wind power, nuclear fusion power. They're way ahead of us. And their fintech, their financial payment system is superb. Their infrastructure building capability is fantastic. Anybody who goes to China and sees, they now have a larger superhighway system than we do by quite a margin. We don't have a single high-speed train in this country. They are connecting every major city with high-speed trains. Every city in China is building subway systems, public transportation. They are the leaders in electric vehicle technology, battery technology, and a whole range of other areas. And we cut ourselves off from them. Who's going to suffer from that? Yeah. You know, they want to invest here. Ford Motor wanted to build a plant with Chinese technology to make batteries for electric vehicles. No, can't do that. Politically, the batteries might listen to the people in the cars or something. I don't know.
Something like that.
Now we're banning TikTok. Why is that? A good deal of it has to do with the fact, complaints that the TikTok algorithm doesn't ban critical comment of Israel. No, this has nothing to do, but of course, it's China, so they must be the enemy, and TikTok must be doing terrible things. I think TikTok is doing terrible things to us, but I think those are things that we're doing to ourselves on TikTok.
Yeah, not the platform itself.
Not right. Somebody in China figuring out how to make a fool of yourself on camera.
So we're running short on time here. I want to get your thoughts on something that's, this terrorist attack that happened in Moscow, because there's some concerning news already coming out. But before we do, I want to ask you one last question here. By all those things you just mentioned there about China and their developments, clearly the last thing in the world they want is any kind of war. They wouldn't want to start something that's going to, subvert all of those things and set them back. So the question then is, do you see anything that would prompt China to actually initiate an attack on Taiwan, short of them making a literal overt declaration of independence, which is what China has always said? But if they don't, can we push too far in any other areas that itself could cause that? Or is China going to hold back no matter what, as long as there's never any declaration?
No, it's more than a declaration of war. I mean, it's self-respect. It's nationalism. It's the success of the revolution, which depends on unifying the country against what the Chinese on the mainland regard as an American sphere of influence in Taiwan. Well, that's basically what it is. So I think this is much more serious than just somebody in Taiwan declaring independence, which basically they have done in all but explicit terms. And so I think the question is China left with any path to the peaceful resolution of its differences with the losing side in the Chinese Civil War and its political heirs? If it is, then it won't do anything. If there is no peaceful settlement option, and it's closing in large measure because of our actions, then I think they will act, and that will be extremely dangerous. I would say there is a parallel here, a different one than the Admiral mentioned with Ukraine. In Ukraine, Putin asked for a negotiation, and he repeatedly did that. And then he demanded a negotiation, and he backed it up with a threat of use of force. And we told him, we're not going to negotiate, and we're not going to do diplomacy with you. And, eat something and die. And so he felt he had no option but to use force, and he did. He did that illegally. It was crossing an international border. Crossing the Taiwan Strait would be not be crossing an international border in the view of almost all countries. Taiwan only has 12 countries that recognize it diplomatically now, out of 190 some. And they recognize it as the government of China, not as an independent Taiwan. So we are, playing with a situation that we frankly misunderstand, and the potential for a tragic outcome is pretty high.
Yeah, not an encouraging thing, but it's something we're going to continue to pay a lot of attention to, and just hope that we can get some better leaders in, both in the Pentagon as well as in the White House. It's always a hope. Just let me have that piece for today.
Do we want another forever war? The definition of a forever war I gave, it's one with no clear objectives, no benchmarks for measuring success or failure, no war termination strategy. Just, some kind of attitude, well, let's do this because we feel good about it. And that doesn't have we don't have any staying power in that when we get into that kind of thing.
We've seen
so,
that, yeah.
We are, the Biden administration had the misfortune to preside over the strategic failure in Afghanistan. We are engaged in a series of geopolitical defeats. That is the case in Ukraine now. It was the case in Afghanistan. Our war in Iraq has done what? Made it safe for Iran and China. Now we are engaged in enabling genocide to the great detriment of our global reputation and credibility.
Right.
We just vetoed a resolution in the Security. We put a resolution in the Security Council that called for a ceasefire, but wasn't directed to anybody. It didn't have any timeline. It didn't say whether it was a temporary ceasefire or a long-term ceasefire. It asked all of the hostages be released, which would deprive Hamas of any bargaining power at all. And and it was too vague. And Algeria voted against it. Others abstained, and Russia and China vetoed it. We knew they were going to veto that. What was the purpose of that resolution? It was to posture for American domestic political effect. See, we really do want a ceasefire. Well, if we want a ceasefire, we can easily have one. All we have to do is stop the weapons supply, and there'll be a ceasefire.
Yeah. It'll be over within a matter of days at that point, because
it could be over in a matter of days.
Yeah, it could be.
Instead, we've been feeding little dribs and dribs of weaponry into this genocide. Over 100 arms sales since October 7th to Israel. Yeah, and we put prepositioned equipment in Israel, not for our use, really, but for the Israelis' use, and they've drawn that down. So,
every way you look at it, we keep harming our own interest, really, in some of the ways that we're doing here. And God help us if we do anything foolish like that in China. I want to shift in the last few minutes we have here. Speaking of the Russia-Ukraine war, there has been some developments in Moscow. So there was a big explosion in I think it's called the Crocus Hall in Moscow, which was a concert venue. And so far, at least according to the reporting coming out, there has been at least 40 killed and 100 wounded. Apparently, there's going to be more than that, because some news I saw just flash on my screen a minute ago is that part of the roof system has already collapsed, and they don't know that everybody was able to get out. Before that, you see there were literally hundreds of people inside when the attack took place. I'm wondering, well, I'll tell you, my concerns are that, like what the Israeli government did after October the 7th, like our government did after 9/11, is an overreaction to whoever either was guilty or whoever is claimed to be guilty. And just before we came on air here, the thing that I was already worried about is that this somehow is blamed on Ukraine. And we had Dmitry Medvedev, chairman of the Russian Security Council, former president, said terrorists understand only retaliatory terror. No trials or investigations will help if force is not countered by force, and deaths are not met with total executions of terrorists and repressions against their families. If it is established that these are terrorists of the Kiev regime, It is impossible to deal with them and their ideological inspires in any other way. All of them must be found and ruthlessly destroyed, including officials of the state that committed such an atrocity, death for death. Now, that's what I'm worried about, that they'll they'll decide that it was Ukraine or backed by Ukraine. And as we're already having some trouble, I don't know if you've seen this, but on the 7th and 8th of October, the 7th and 8th of this month of March, the U.S. Embassy put out this very specific warning that said that they were telling all Americans to avoid any large gathering because of extremist potentials, including in concert venues, which of course didn't happen. And I've already seen Russian media and Telegram channels are already all over this, as claiming that we knew something was coming, wanted our people to get taken care of. And what do you think, and what are you going to be watching for is the risk of over response by Russia? So far, Putin has not made any comments.
Medvedev, who made that statement, has a reputation for rather extreme and provocative threats. Mr. Putin is the one who will decide. In my estimation, he is a rational, cool, calm actor, and he will not overreact. But on the other hand, if it is established that this was done by or on behalf of the Ukrainian government, we think we can expect a major escalation. And that escalation could spill beyond Ukraine, because American officials, members of our political elite, and members of the executive branch have been, like Victoria Nuland, who just left the government, have been urging Ukraine to strike deep into Russia. Remember that from the point of view of the neoconservatives, the purpose of the Ukraine war is not to protect Ukrainians or Ukraine, but to, quote, weaken and isolate Russia, to punish Russia. This is punishment for Russia. The problem with it is it's very likely to lead to counteractions that will be far more painful for Ukraine and possibly the West. And it raises the danger of further escalation. And we've already seen this in some Russian comments, even before this terrorist act, that they think the, quote, special military operation is becoming a real war in which the lid is off. Special military operation means limited objectives, limited use of force, limited war. This is getting pretty close to justifying something well beyond that.
Well, and I saw that Peskov, their official spokesman of the Kremlin, yesterday officially said, no, this is actually a state of war, for the first time that he officially said it,
right?
Not by accident. So
that's what I'm referring to.
Adding to that is, it's concerning, because if that's what they were thinking before this, and this would seem to provide a lot more emotion and ammunition for something to happen. What form do you think it could take? I mean, what might you be looking for? What ways could they escalate in response to this?
Well, they have a huge number of options. I don't think I particularly want to foreshadow their decision. I hope they will be restrained, but I think it's asking a lot. We don't even know who died in this explosion. I suspect it was the relatives of some pretty important people, and we'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see. I hope that the Russian government, unlike our government after 9/11, does not lose its cool.
Well, you certainly have to hope that's the case, because the consequences for the region and for the world, and with so many other things going on, could be catastrophic. And man, we're just gonna have to hope that that's the case. It just sounds odd to even say out loud that I hope that Putin is the one that thinks with the calm and the cool head and doesn't react the way we have in the past. But that's where we are. And as you said, the state of our foreign policy is almost non-existent in diplomacy. And
we don't talk to Mr. Putin. We don't talk to the Chinese very much, and we don't talk to Iran except once in a while when we really are panicked. as we have been recently over the Houthi enforcement of a land-based sea blockade on Israel. And by the way, with regard to that, I think it's very interesting. China and Russia have just done a deal with the Houthis explicitly, exempting their ships because they're not going to carry cargo to Israel. And we are protecting the ships that are carrying stuff to Israel that is essential for their conduct of their mass murder in Gaza. So I think our policies are pretty incoherent and very unstrategic, and some of them are very risky. And if we had anything to do with this thing, I
shudder to think what happened next. Yeah. Well, listen, we really appreciate you coming on today, Mr. Ambassador. As always, some terrific historical context, and then seeing things in the true light of they are, and just laying this out for us, so we really have a good grasp of what's going on here and understand how these things affect American national security and what we should be doing. So, thank you very much for coming on, and we look forward to having you back real soon.
Next time, pick a happy topic.
I'll try. I'd love to. And listen, we thank you guys for coming too. This has been a big week. We've had a lot of good shows for you today because we are going to remain unintimidated and uncompromised for you. And folks, you're not going to want to miss any of our shows next week. Not only are we going to stay on top of this whole Russia terrorist attack in Moscow, you can count on a show tomorrow. For sure. On Saturday, we're going to update you whatever happens overnight. I'm sure as more things become clear, we're going to stay on top of this for you. So keep looking back for updated information here. Next week, we have John Mearsheimer. We have Doug McGregor. We have Jacques Baud coming back again. Ian Puddock from London, another show favorite. So there's some great shows coming up next week. You're not going to want to miss those. But in the meantime, we will see you tomorrow on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.